A place so saturated with death that the very soil beneath your feet is composed of 50% human ash. A place where the wind doesn't just whistle through the ruins, it carries the faint, rhythmic echoes of a bell that hasn't been rung in nearly a century. This is Poveglia. To the locals in Venice, it is simply known as the Island of No Return. It's a patch of land in the Venetian lagoon so cursed that fishermen refuse to cast their nets nearby, fearing they might pull up a skull instead of a catch. But the true horror of Poveglia isn't just in its past as a plague pit. It's in what happened later, within the walls of a crumbling psychiatric hospital, involving a surgeon whose experiments defied every law of God and man. Why did a man dedicated to healing suddenly start drilling into the brains of his patients? And what exactly was waiting for him at the top of the bell tower on that final moonless night?
The Venetian lagoon is a place of breathtaking beauty, a network of islands that have stood as a testament to human ingenuity for over 1,000 years. But among these jewels lies a jagged, dark stone, Poveglia. In the late 1700s, Venice was the jewel of the Mediterranean, but it was a jewel plagued by a recurring nightmare. The Black Death was ravaging Europe, and Poveglia was chosen as the ultimate barrier. Any ship suspected of carrying the plague was diverted here. It wasn't a hospital, it was a waiting room for the afterlife. Men, women, and children were dumped onto these shores, often while still alive, their bodies covered in the telltale black buboes. They were thrown into massive pits and set ablaze. History suggests that over 160,000 people drew their last breath on this tiny island. The scale of the carnage was so immense that even today the ground remains a grayish, powdery texture, the literal remains of generations of Venetians. It is a mass grave disguised as an island, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead has been worn thin by sheer volume. To understand the weight of Poveglia, one must understand the absolute terror of the plague years. In 1348, nearly half of Venice's population was wiped out in a single summer. The city, built on water, had nowhere to put the bodies. They tried burying them in churchyards, but the ground was too shallow, and the stench became unbearable. That was when they turned their eyes toward the lagoon. Poveglia was not the first lazaretto, but it became the most notorious. It was a place of isolation, where the sounds of the city were replaced by the crackling of funeral pyres.
The lazaretto system was a Venetian invention, a precursor to modern quarantine, but on Poveglia it was practiced with a brutal efficiency. If a doctor, clad in his terrifying beak-masked robes, tapped your door with a staff, your life was effectively over. You were loaded onto a black barge and rowed away as your family wailed from the shore. Mystery Code has analyzed the historical records of the Lazaretto Vecchio and Poveglia, and the distinction is chilling. While other islands were used for quarantine, Poveglia was where they sent the hopeless. During the height of the 1630 plague, the city was so desperate that they didn't even wait for people to die. If you showed a fever, you were taken. Families were torn apart on the docks of Venice, watching their loved ones disappear into the morning mist, toward an island from which no one ever returned. The smoke from the cremation pits was said to be so thick it could be seen from St. Mark's Square, a constant, soot-filled reminder of the fragility of life.
This isn't just folklore, it is a geological reality. Modern excavations have found layers of bones stacked like cordwood, fused together by the intense heat of the fires.
The 1630 outbreak was particularly devastating. It was brought to the city by an ambassador from Mantua, and within weeks, the death toll was so high that the Pizzighieri, the men responsible for collecting the dead, couldn't keep up. On Poveglia, the conditions were hellish. There were no beds, no medicine, and very little food. People were left to die in the open air, huddled together for warmth as the plague consumed them.
It is said that the cries of the dying could be heard as far away as Lido, a haunting chorus that fueled the legends of the island's curse. When the plague finally receded, the island was left as a scarred, silent wasteland, a place where the very atmosphere felt heavy with the grief of the unburied.
But as the plague faded into history, Poveglia didn't find peace. It sat abandoned for decades, a silent sentinel in the lagoon, until 1922. That year, the existing buildings were converted into a mental asylum. It was a convenient solution for the city, sending the unwanted to a place where they could be easily forgotten. The architecture of the island changed. Bars were added to the windows, and the old fortifications were reinforced. However, the patients began reporting something terrifying almost immediately. They claimed they could see the plague victims. They described spirits with rotting flesh wandering the halls, their silent screams vibrating in the air. They spoke of the gray men who would stand at the foot of their beds at night, pointing toward the earth. But because these reports came from people labeled as insane, the staff ignored them. They dismissed the sightings as hallucinations, a byproduct of their fractured minds. The doctors at the time were more interested in the new theories of psychiatry than in the superstitions of their charges. They believed that mental illness was a physical ailment that could be cured through physical intervention. This was the era of the lobotomy, a procedure that was as brutal as it was ineffective. On Poveglia, far from the oversight of the mainland, these practices took on a dark, experimental edge. Little did they know that the island was about to breed a monster far more dangerous than any ghost. Enter the director of the hospital, a man whose name has been scrubbed from many official records, but lives on in local whispers as Dr. Paulo. He was a brilliant surgeon, but he was obsessed with finding the physical seat of madness. He believed that if he could just adjust the brain, he could cure the incurable. In the isolated bell tower of the asylum, far from prying eyes, he began his work. He didn't use modern tools. He used hammers, chisels, and hand-cranked drills. He performed crude lobotomies on his patients without anesthesia, convinced that he was on the verge of a medical breakthrough. He wasn't looking for a cure. He was looking for control. Mystery Code believes that the isolation of Poveglia acted as a catalyst, stripping away the doctor's morality until only a cold, clinical curiosity remained. The patients were no longer human beings to him. They were maps, and he was determined to chart the darkest corners of their consciousness. The doctor's experiments were not limited to lobotomies. He was reportedly fascinated by the effects of sensory deprivation and extreme cold. He would lock patients in the basement cells during the winter months, watching through a small grate as they succumbed to the freezing damp of the lagoon. He kept meticulous journals, filled with sketches of the brain, and notes on how the spirits of the island seemed to influence the outcome of his surgeries. His staff began to fear him as much as the patients did. They noticed that he would spend hours talking to himself in the bell tower, his voice rising in an angry cadence that echoed across the courtyard. He claimed he was consulting with the former inhabitants of the island, the ones who had been burned in the pits. The screams from the tower became a regular occurrence, yet no one intervened. The staff stayed in the main wards, terrified of the man who ruled the island with an iron fist and a blood-stained chisel. They could hear the rhythmic thump-thump of his tools echoing down the spiral staircase. But then, the reports changed. The doctor himself began to change. He started complaining of the same visions his patients had described. He spoke of shadows that didn't move with the light, and voices that whispered his name from the corners of his office. He became paranoid, locking himself in the bell tower for days. He claimed the plague ghosts were demanding a final payment for the ground he had desecrated with his experiments. The hunter had become the hunted. He began to see the faces of the people he had treated in the swirling fog of the lagoon. Dr. Paulo's descent into madness was rapid and violent. He began to believe that his own brain was infected by the madness of the island. He was found one morning by a nurse, sitting in the center of his office, having used a scalpel to remove large sections of his own hair in an attempt to access the source.
he was incoherent, raving about the bell that never stops. The bell in the tower, which had been disconnected for years, was the focus of his obsession. He claimed it was ringing constantly, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated in his very bones. No one else could hear it, but the doctor was convinced it was the signal for his final transformation.
One evening, the silence of the island was shattered. The bell in the tower, which had been disconnected for years, began to toll. It was a heavy, mournful sound that echoed across the lagoon, reaching the ears of fishermen miles away. The staff rushed to the courtyard and looked up. There, standing on the very edge of the tower's parapet, was Dr. Paulo. He looked down at them, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed anything his patients had ever felt. He didn't just fall. Witnesses say he was pushed by something unseen, a thick gray mist that curled around his throat like a spectral noose. He plummeted to the ground, hitting the pavement with a sickening crack. But he didn't die on impact. As he lay there, gasping his last breath, a nurse claimed that a wisp of that same mist rose from the earth and choked the remaining life out of him. The island had reclaimed its own. In the aftermath of the doctor's death, the asylum was shut down. The patients were transferred, and the staff fled, leaving behind half-eaten meals and medical records that are still scattered across the floors today. For years, the Italian government tried to ignore Poveglia. They attempted to sell it, to lease it, to turn it into a luxury hotel, but every attempt failed. In the 1960s, a family purchased the island, hoping to build a holiday home. They stayed exactly one night. They left before dawn, their young daughter suffering from a deep gash on her face that she claimed was given to her by a man in a tower. They never returned, and they refused to even talk about what they had seen. In 2014, a businessman won the auction to lease the island for 99 years, intending to restore the buildings. He arrived with a team of architects, but they didn't last 48 hours. They reported hearing the sound of a bell ringing in the middle of the night, despite the fact that the bell had been removed decades ago. They felt hands pushing them toward the edges of the ruins. The project was abandoned, and the island was returned to the ghosts. It seems that Poveglia has no interest in being restored or civilized. It wants to remain as it is, a graveyard of the soul, a place where the weight of the past is too heavy for the living to bear.
Today, Poveglia stands as a rotting monument to human suffering. The buildings are being reclaimed by nature, vines choking the windows where patients once peered out at a world they would never see again. The bell tower still stands, a jagged finger pointing toward the sky, serving as a reminder that some places are not meant to be inhabited. Is it just a legend, or does the ash of 100,000 souls truly hold a grudge? Mystery Code believes this is a vital piece of the puzzle. The emotional imprint left by such massive loss of life can create a feedback loop that persists through time.
When you walk there, you aren't walking on dirt. You are walking on the people who were denied a proper burial, the people who were experimented on, and the man who thought he could play God. The mystery of Poveglia isn't whether it's haunted, it's whether the darkness that consumed Dr. Paulo is still waiting for its next visitor. The ground is literally a graveyard of the forgotten. If you were to take a shovel and dig anywhere on the island, you would find bone fragments within seconds. This isn't an exaggeration. It is the reason why the Italian government has declared the island a restricted zone. You need special permits just to land a boat there, and even then, most boatmen will leave you at the dock and wait in the middle of the channel, refusing to step foot on the shore. They know the stories of the cursed soil and the bell of the dead. Scientific expeditions to the island have yielded strange results. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP, captured in the old wards are among the clearest ever recorded, with voices speaking in an archaic Venetian dialect that hasn't been used in centuries. Temperature fluctuations are extreme, with rooms dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. But most disturbing is the feeling of the island. Every visitor,
From skeptics to paranormal investigators, reports a crushing sense of despair that lingers long after they have left the lagoon. It is as if the island itself is a parasite, feeding on the emotions of those who dare to visit. Mystery Code believes that Poveglia is a thin place, a location where the veil between our world and the next is virtually non-existent. The sheer volume of traumatic deaths, combined with the desecration of the bodies and the later horrors of the asylum, has created a permanent rift. It is a place that exists outside of time, where the screams of the 1630 plague victims and the rhythmic thumping of Dr. Paolo's chisel are part of the same eternal moment. To step onto Poveglia is to step out of the present and into a collective nightmare. As the sun sets over the Venetian lagoon, Poveglia vanishes into the fog. It remains a forbidden zone, a place where the past refuses to stay buried. We may never know the full extent of the experiments conducted in that tower, or the identity of the entities that drove a surgeon to his death. But one thing is certain: the bells of Poveglia don't need a rope to ring. They ring for the forgotten, the tormenting, and for anyone brave or foolish enough to listen to the whispers of the island of no return. Mystery Code will continue to dig into these dark corners of history, because the truth often hides where no one dares to look. The echoes of the past are never truly silent. They are just waiting for the right moment to be heard. And on Poveglia, that moment is always now.